There is really so much to say about Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s life and legacy. After all, he is the only American with a holiday named after him. In this moment, for the Jewish people, for the American Jewish people, however, one that is defined by a pending ceasefire hostage deal, flaming destruction in Los Angeles, and a presidential transition of power, one of suspended relief and cautious hope around this ceasefire hostage deal 469 days into this nightmare, one of helplessness and loss as firefighters try to contain the blaze in Southern California, one in which the political tension in this country is once again brought to bear in advance of Inauguration Day. In all of the overwhelm that I just described, I'd like to highlight one particular aspect of Dr. King's leadership that might help us carry on in the face of these emotionally tenuous times: Dr. King's spiritual endurance. At the intersection of resilience and community, vision and faith is where you can find Dr. King's spiritual endurance. This is a man, a modern-day prophet, who stuck by his principles of nonviolence, love, equality, and dignity in the face of tremendous racial violence and intimidation. Dr. King was held at gunpoint, he was stabbed, he was thrown in jail 29 times, his house bombed, he was under constant surveillance. He witnessed horrific violence and systemic disenfranchisement. How did he possibly keep his dream alive when all the cards were stacked against him and the African American people in the United States? How did he overcome their circumstances that would have much more logically led to despair than to civil rights legislation? He did so by exercising this spiritual endurance that we could all use some of right now. The ability to absorb public and existential hardship over an unforeseen amount of time and still maintain a sense of self, of purpose, and of meaning. He did so by leaning on his community, on his faith tradition, and by always leading according to his principles and his movement's goals. You can trace this inner resolve to the very beginning of Dr. King's leadership in Montgomery, Alabama, as pastor of Dexter Avenue Baptist Church and an emerging civil rights leader. When Rosa Parks was arrested for refusing to vacate her seat on a segregated bus, Dr. King was tapped as a leader of a budding movement. He was the voice of a group of people who planned a one-day bus boycott on December 5th, 1955. It was supposed to end along with Montgomery's bus segregation on December 6th, but instead, it lasted until December 20th of the following year, 1956. What was supposed to be one day of walking, carpooling, and taxiing instead of busing ended up being 381. And while they are vastly different circumstances, we also know about anxiously waiting beyond what we had anticipated, with the added magnitude and uncertainty and months of this hostage situation. What shouldn't have even been one day of captivity in Gaza is now 469, and we will continue to wait with bated breath as hostages are released a few at a time, as details for future phases of the deal are negotiated, as we hope and pray that all parties adhere to the terms upon which they agreed. Despite these being such different contexts, I am not arguing that the civil rights movement was like this war, but despite this, there is wisdom from the approach of those civil rights leaders that we can use for ourselves today. Like Dr. King had in his church community, in the NAACP, and in the Montgomery Improvement Association, we have each other, a community on whom we can lean in the cautiously hopeful and uncertain days ahead. It is extremely important to know that we have each other. And that informed Dr. King's spiritual endurance, this connection to community. Several years later, in 1963, one of those 29 times that Dr. King spent in jail was in Birmingham, Alabama, for demonstrating against racial segregation once again. Not only was he in jail, but the Birmingham police put him in solitary confinement for 8 days. And it's over the course of these 8 days, on the margins of newspapers and on spare napkins, that Dr. King wrote the letter from the Birmingham jail. In this letter, disconnected from those around him, Dr. King connected himself to his religious tradition, including our shared tradition of the Hebrew prophets, as he challenged his white colleagues and readers to feel the urgency of their struggle. He wrote that he was compelled to carry the gospel of freedom beyond his hometown. This, too, is a lesson to inform our sense of spiritual endurance. Even when it feels like we're alone, we can connect ourselves to our own faith tradition. That very faith tradition that begins the telling of the Israelites' exodus from slavery to freedom in this week's Torah portion, what Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel called the very first conference on religion and race. 2 years later, and this informed the connection to tradition that Dr. King exemplified in his spiritual endurance. So 2 years later, Dr. King and his fellow leaders of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference traveled to Selma, Alabama, to peacefully protest the racial barriers to voter registration. If you know of Selma, or of Bloody Sunday, or can imagine the image of the rabbi I just mentioned, Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, walking alongside Dr. King, you may think that the events of Selma unfolded over a week or two. But in reality, Dr. King spent 2.5 months in Selma, navigating strategic differences he had with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, with Malcolm X, and with the President's office as they pursued the right to vote. Part of his success was navigating those tensions within and outside of the civil rights movement. He led with his principles, the principles of nonviolence, love, dignity, equality, and with specific goals. In this case, the removal of those racist barriers to voter registration. These two inform our current moment. While Inauguration Day on Monday will usher in a new president and cabinet, the political differences highlighted by this transition only remind us how important it is to connect with one another beyond political affiliation, toward our shared values and vision that we hope to see in our country and its institutions. And this is Dr. King's commitment to his principles and to his specific goals. This isn't to say that Dr. King didn't get tired or overwhelmed himself. His health declined with each year, and he had anticipated his own assassination. But what he was able to inspire and accomplish in less than 13 years as a public leader is nothing short of remarkable, and speaks to what I'm calling his spiritual endurance, all that helped carry him up the steep mountain that he spoke about in his very last speech, the solidarity and connection he felt with those who participated alongside him in nonviolent resistance, the tradition of challenging oppression dating all the way back to Moses and Pharaoh, and by repeatedly referring to the principles he upheld of nonviolence, love, equality, and dignity. He did this with connection to community, connection to tradition, and connection to his principles and his movement's goals. As I mentioned before, Dr. King is the only American with a holiday named for him. And that's not the only reason why he is a difficult act to emulate. He was an incredibly gifted thinker, writer, speaker, and leader, truly a modern-day prophet. But we can emulate those practices of his that gave him such strong spiritual endurance. We can lean on each other, we can lean on our tradition, and we can live by our principles and our goals. That is within our power. The tools with which we can face a moment such as this, awaiting the safe and complete return of the hostages, the rebuilding of the Los Angeles area, and the transition of power in the United States. Dr. King famously said that the arc of the universe is long and that it bends toward justice. May it also bend toward love and peace, dignity, rebuilding, and reconciliation here in Los Angeles, in Washington, D.C., in Israel, and in Gaza. Shabbat Shalom.